The International Monetary Fund says it's no longer predicting a global recession, but warns the fight against high inflation is not over. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. With China's reopening and the resilience of consumers, the International Monetary Fund issued a brighter outlook this week for the global economy. The global outlook is projected to slow to 2.9% in 2023, with inflation declining to 6.6%. As for the world's two largest economies, the US growth is expected to slow to 1.4%, while China's output is expected to accelerate to 5.2% this year. In fact, China and India are expected to drive growth in 2023. China's manufacturing sector rose in January for the first time in months, and domestic travel experienced a huge boost during the Chinese New Year.
China's recovery is going to have a big impact on other parts of the world. We've got an estimate that for every 1 percentage point that China grows faster, the rest of the world grows faster by 0.3. So this is definitely a positive development.
For more now on the global economy, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from London is Klisman Murati. He's the founder of Pareto Economics, a global affairs research consultancy. Also with us from New York is Anthony Chan. He's the former chief economist for JP Morgan Chase. From Boston, Jorge Jaime served as the Chilean ambassador to China and is currently a research professor with the Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. And Xu Shuang is the assistant director of the International Monetary Institute in Beijing. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Xu Shuang, the IMF forecast has China's growth rate for 2023 at 5.2%. That's a 2% improvement over last year. Here is the IMF chief economist, Pierre-Olivier Gourancha.
To China, so very clearly the development since our last round of forecast in October has been the reopening of the economy. But what we're seeing after that is a stabilization of the economy, fully reopened and fully able to produce and consume, etc. And so that's a major factor behind our upward revision for China in 2022.
So, Xu Shuang, do you believe that current conditions in China bear out this forecast that we're hearing from the IMF? Has the country got over the challenges of COVID?
Oh, yes. I do believe Blanchard's prediction is quite correct. Actually, the number could be a bit higher. There's two angles into this. First of all, you have to see that in the Spring Festival, there are shopping frenzy. Like the revenge spending happened in the USA and in Europe and in Japan and Korea after their reopening. The curve is there is very, very sharp. People are going around and tourists everywhere. This is true, and the people are really very enthusiastic. And also, there's another reason for the sharp recovery is the base number of 2022 is really, really low. So judging from this increase, you can see the number of this year is going to be really, really good compared to other counterpart countries. But also you have to see we still have challenges ahead of us. For example, the unemployment rate for the young people, especially under 25 years old, are still very low for now. And also you're going to see the saving ratio is still very, very high. Until we can see these numbers are changed dramatically, we are not sure how the quality of the recovery, putting aside the numbers of the recovery, but the quality of the recovery, how good can it be in this year, can be challenging.
Now, Xu Shuang, earlier this week, President Xi Jinping talked of a new pattern of development for China. What's that about?
Well, you have to understand in the past, China relies on the trade, or our economy can be export-oriented. And later on, in the past 10 years, I think the investment on the infrastructures can be the major driver for the economy to grow. But right now, I think one missing piece in the jigsaw is the consumption. We really need to increase people's income so we can be more domestic demand driven. So I think President Xi really wants to increase this part to have China, to economy to stand on the tripod more stable. more stably. So I think in the next coming 5 years, increasing people's income and to make Chinese economy to be more consumption-driven, domestically driven, is going to be the key.
Anthony Chan, the picture in the United States is somewhat different. Growth is expected to fall to 1.4% from 2% in 2022, and some analysts are talking of a soft recession. What is your assessment?
Well, I think that if you look at the M2 money supply in the United States in the last month, it actually went negative on a year-over-year basis. And historically, when that happens, at some point, you will see that economic growth is going to slow down. In fact, the Atlanta Federal Reserve has a nowcast real GDP model, and they're looking for economic growth to be in the 1% range in the first quarter. So you're seeing some weakness there. You also heard today from the Federal Reserve that they're going to continue to raise short-term interest rates. So they're not going to give up their fight against inflation. So all these pressures, namely rising short-term interest rates and slower economic growth moving forward, do in fact raise the risk that we can certainly move into at least a mild recession. I say mild because balance sheets for consumers and businesses are still stronger than you'd normally see right before a recession. But economic growth in the United States is certainly going to be weaker in 2023 relative to 2022, because unlike in China, where Xi Jinping actually is now talking about stimulating consumer spending, in the United States, we're moving in the other direction. We know that we now have a debt ceiling coming up, and Republicans, again, I say this in a nonpartisan manner, are talking about slowing the growth of government spending. So all signs point in the direction of more restrictive monetary policy, potentially more restrictive fiscal policy. So we don't see any stimulus. And that's why economic growth is going to be slower. And given the fact that economic growth is not that rapid to begin with, it does increase the risk. But the good news is, I think if we do get a recession, it's probably going to be mild.
Now, Anthony, you mentioned the interest rates there. In fact, the Federal Reserve announced on Wednesday it's increasing the benchmark interest rate by 0.25%. That's the 8th increase since March. Here's the Fed Chairman, Jerome Powell. Let's listen to him.
We have been taking forceful steps to moderate demand so that it comes into better alignment with supply. Our overarching focus is using our tools to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Reducing inflation is likely to require a period of below-trend growth and some softening of labor market conditions. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices over the longer run.
So, Anthony, we had inflation at a peak of 9.1% in June, but it has been coming down. But you say we are going to see more rate increases.
Oh, absolutely, because that 9.1% is now 6.5%, and it's still very far away from the 2% inflation target that the Fed has. Now, of course, there are many different inflation indicators, and the preferred one of Chairman Powell is to look at services prices, because the goods sector has actually slowed down, and they want to look at service prices excluding housing. That is now growing at 4.1%, down from 4.3%, but still sharply above the 2% target. And they're really focused on wages, and wages are still rising far too fast. Wages, if you look at average hourly earnings, they're running at 4.6% year over year. They'd like that to grow by 2% plus the average growth in productivity, which is about 1%. So they still need to bring that 4.6% number down to 3%. And wages are appearing to be somewhat sticky. So yes, the Federal Reserve is likely to continue to keep raising interest rates for a little longer. And by the way, when they stop raising rates, they're not likely to lower rates in the second half of the year as the market expects. And in fact, today, the Fed chairman reiterated his view that he didn't expect the Fed to cut rates, even though the market expects them to do so.
Klisman Murati, let's talk about the situation in the United Kingdom. Now there we have the UK is expected to shrink. And that's when we're looking at all advanced economies around the world. I mean, even Russia, which is facing some of the harshest and most stringent sanctions is expected to do better than the UK. Why is there such a drag in the United Kingdom?
The United Kingdom has gone through not only the issues of the Ukraine-Russia war, but has been consistently impacted by internal policy, be it Brexit, and then COVID, and now you see the Russia-Ukraine war consistently impact its fiscal and monetary stances throughout this period. And it's very hard as an economist or even as a Joe Blogs on the street to really understand what has impacted what, because you can't delineate the impacts of Brexit, for example, to the impacts of the other macro shocks that has impacted the entire economy. So right now, the UK is facing a very high inflation like the rest of the world. The Bank of England has also planned on increasing interest rates yet again to curb this inflation. But at the same time, we're seeing a geopolitical environment which is on the doorstep of the UK, still not being solved. And with conversations in the military field that Russia will step up operations in Ukraine, not making the situation any better. So it's a mixture of these factors, which I think is unique to the UK, which again, Russia has its own problems. And although, fiscal numbers in Russia may seem on the surface better, believe you me, the situation in Russia in the long term is a lot worse than the situation in the UK.
Now, Klisman, we are also seeing industrial action, waves of industrial action actually, in the United Kingdom, thousands of workers taking to the streets. What are their main grievances, and how is the government responding to that?
Well, I think the main grievances of any strike action is obviously pay increases. That's what the majority of strike action is looking for as a remedy to this high inflationary environment that we're seeing today. So the government really has a lot on its plate because many different industries, public and private sector, have gone on strike and are continuing their strike action, which is slowing down operations, especially when you look at transportation. The Office of National Statistics published a report saying 1 in 5 UK adults are impacted by strike action, but also in the healthcare sector, a lot of issues there with nurses and doctors wanting pay increases above inflation, actually to curb this cost of living crisis. So the government really needs to decide, do they actually increase wages or do they find ways to decrease inflation? And they need to really set out a timeline with these stakeholders, with these trade unions, to tell them what their plan is to curb inflation, because that's probably one of the best ways to remedy the situation, because increasing pay only increases the likelihood of continued problems as time goes on. So the UK is in a very unique situation in that sense, because we haven't seen much strike action across Europe, at least to the extent that we see in the UK. But this is not only due to current cost of living crises, but also a long list of grievances that especially the healthcare sector has been facing. And now this is sort of a perfect storm of inflation and past grievances coming together.
Ambassador Jorge Heiner, the IMF has growth across Latin America at 1.8%. Brazil and Mexico are expected to do better, though, but inflation continues to be a drag on the continent. We have it at 8% in Brazil, Mexico, and Chile. What are the biggest challenges for Latin America?
Great question. Well, let me say the following. Latin America is emerging out of what ECLAC, the United Nations Commission for Economic Development in Latin America and the Caribbean, has said has been the worst crisis in the region in 120 years. Latin American economy as a whole had negative growth of 6.6% in 2020, the worst of any region in the world. We are now slowly coming out of that, but the predictions for this year, according to the IMF, is not very encouraging, 1.8%, and for 2024, 2.1%. So the region is in really dire straits. It was impacted very severely by the pandemic. With 8% of the world's population, it has had 30% of the world's deaths from COVID. So that gives you an idea of how bad things are. And it has been very difficult for the region to come out of that. There are some encouraging signs. There was a recent meeting of CELAC, the regional organization that brought together many leaders from across the region in Buenos Aires on January 24th. And there's some talk on moving forward on a number of issues. One of the things that has been on the table, for example, is finalizing the deal between Mercosur and the European Union that has been around for being negotiated for I don't know how many years, maybe 15 years or so. There's the possibility has been mooted, and President Lula has mentioned it, of a possibility of an FTA between Mercosur and China. That will be a real breakthrough. But the situation in the region is not in good shape, and important initiatives need to be taken to move the region forward.
So looking again at that statement from the IMF's Daniel Lee, which we heard earlier in the show, he said for every 1 percentage point that China grows faster, the rest of the world grows faster by 0.3%. And I'm wondering, with many of the Latin American economies very closely linked to China, and with this relatively high growth rate forecast for China, could China be a driver of growth in Latin America?
Absolutely. And for example, Chile is the biggest producer and exporter of copper in the world. And all indications are that demand for copper in China will increase for the traditional reasons, but also particularly for in the case of electric mobility, in which China is playing such a significant role, and also in the demand for other commodities. So I think that can be an encouraging sign as well. Now, the other thing that's interesting about the relationship between China and Latin America, I was looking at some numbers the other day, and that is, believe it or not, in 2021, there was more Chinese investment in Latin America than there was in the United States, and more or less comparable with what happened in the European Union. So I think we may see more Chinese investment in Brazil, according to those figures, garnered what is perhaps the biggest Chinese investment abroad in 2021, 5.9 billion. So it seems to me not just trade, but also Chinese investment can be a driving force for Latin American growth in years to come.
Xu Shuang, let's get back to China. Its manufacturing sector, there was a rise there in January, that's for the first time in 3 months. What can you tell us about that?
Well, manufacturing sector is absolutely one of the most important pillars for China's economy and of our national strengths. That's for sure. And we have already seen, as I just mentioned, the employment ratio can be a really important factor. And in the manufacturing sector, even in the Spring Festival, we have already seen the first sign of a shortage of hands. So they've been starting to, recruit people, and the sales can be really good. We mentioned the recession probably is going to be minor than what expected in this new year. So I think the foreign trade can still be a very, very reliable sector of the Chinese economy of this year. So I'm confident for the manufacturing sector, especially when China has been upgrading the whole value chain. It will become more tax savvy and have more value added. So this sector can be, you can count on that.
And Xu Shuang, international trade has been hit very hardly by supply chain issues. Where are we now as far as supply chain issues are concerned? I mean, China is one of the most important links in that chain.
Yes, I think the great news for the whole world is that, first of all, inflation and stagnation can be the two problems we're facing as a whole. But when China gets back into the market, the consumer of Chinese market can produce more of the demand. So this is a good cure for the stagnation problem we're having. And also because Chinese supply chain has been back online, so we've been seeing more efficient, the producers can back online, and the cost can be controllable and the price can be more affordable. So this has been another good cure for the inflation part we're facing. So one or two factors that come in here, you're going to see today and this year as a stagflation problem we're facing can be much, much more mitigated.
Anthony Chan, the United States hit a debt limit of 1.4 trillion. The Treasury is taking what they call extraordinary measures to pay the bills, but that's only until June. But then, of course, politics gets in the way. What happens if Congress does not raise the debt ceiling?
Well, I think that if you push it to the limit, no pun intended, and you go until June or July, and you have to end up closing the government, we'll see what we've seen many times before. At that point, government or Congress goes into a crisis type of negotiation. And I think at that point, the odds increase that you actually pass a debt limit bill without many of the cuts that they're requesting right now during the preliminary negotiation period, where the Republicans are saying they will sign in or certainly cooperate if somehow the rest of the Congress or the Democrats agree to some budget cuts. But if all of a sudden things get pushed to the brink, at that point it's a panic situation, and I think that Congress would operate differently and probably just rush to pass a debt limit increase without getting these cuts that the Republicans are talking about now. So the reality is that if a deal is done quicker, you're more likely to get some budget cuts. And again, the estimates are that for every 1% cut in government spending growth, you save about $1 trillion over the next 10 years. You might get some of that if you get a preliminary deal. But if you wait until the limit or wait until the brink where the government is closed, there'll be a panic type of situation, and you probably continue to spend at the pace that you've been spending and no real restriction on growth. So it behooves both parties to reach a deal before you get to that June or July drop dead date.
Klisman Murati, you were talking earlier on, you mentioned Brexit when we looked at the economic situation in the United Kingdom. I was listening to a statement that was made by one of the luminaries of the ruling Conservative Party, Jacob Rees-Mogg. He seemed to dismiss that Brexit is having much of an impact on what we're seeing in the United Kingdom right now. In fact, he felt that now the United Kingdom is unshackled from Europe and is therefore set to become really a global power in as far as the economy is concerned. But to what extent is Brexit contributing to the sort of economic woes that we see now in the UK?
I don't know what Jacob Rees-Mogg uses to prove his fact, because if you see the situation in the UK as it stands, you know, it's very hard to delineate, as I mentioned before, how Brexit would have impacted the UK economy without the two other external factors, such as COVID and the war in Ukraine. But what you can see, for example, is when it comes time to trading with the biggest trade partner that we have in the world right now, the EU, which is literally across the British Channel going into France, when you have the past rules and regulations which dictated trade between them now needing to renew, you have a lot more fees, taxes, and paperwork to fill out when it comes time to doing trade with your closest partner. So costs in general for businesses who trade with the EU, either buying or selling, are now going to increase. They have increased since Brexit, which again is putting more costs on businesses. And when interest rates are where they are, you know, asking for more money from your customers who are already feeling the pinch isn't a good sign at all. So it has compounded the problems that we're seeing now. Naturally, Brexit didn't cause the high inflation environment that we're in, but given the fact that in general it's costing more to do business with your largest trading partner, even theoretically, if you were just to put that point out to someone like Jacob Rees-Mogg, I think he would agree. But mentioning Brexit, he thinks that this is sort of the panacea to all of the UK's problems. So that's a negative of Brexit. I suppose if you were to pick a positive of Brexit, for example, now that preferred travel from the EU market for employment has now disintegrated, there's a much more even playing field for talent across the world who can now compete on a more even playing field for employment opportunities in the UK. And at this, I'm looking at the Indian market for IT workers. Before, there was preferential treatment for EU workers for tech. Now that that sort of rule has gone out the window, there's a much more even playing field where employees from other parts of the world can compete for jobs in the UK. But that's a very minor benefit. But I think negatives outweigh the positives.
Ambassador Heine, let's get back to Latin America, talk about Chile. The central bank governor there, Rosana Costa, she is pushing back against calls that have been made to cut interest rates. Interest rates now currently at 11.25%. I mean, could Chile fall into a recession?
Well, all indicators are that Chile this year will have negative growth. So, I mean, that would obviously be a recession. Now, the argument is being made that this is a necessary correction, that Chile spent way too much in the wake of the pandemic, and that, well, it has to get its house in order. So, you know, there's an argument to be made for restricting spending and keeping high interest rates. But still, the bottom line is that Chile, that used to be one of the fastest growing economies in Latin America, the jaguar of Latin America, this year will have negative growth, which is obviously not a good thing. And it seems to me it is emblematic of the very difficult situation the region finds itself in. Now, let me add a footnote to that. You were mentioning earlier that today's growth of the world economy, about half of it will be driven by both Chinese growth and by India's growth, which is projected to have a very strong performance as well. Well, as a former ambassador both to India and then to China, I've been saying for a long time that is where the Latin American countries should place their bets. It is in our relations with Asia that we must really work on. And it seems to me what is happening in the projections for this year of the IMF would seem to vindicate that claim that I've been making for a long time.
Sure, one other point. The United States Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, he will be going to China. He will be holding talks there with the Chinese Foreign Minister, Qin Gang. But analysts here in the United States are not too excited about that. They are playing down expectations. What do you expect to come out of that?
Well, I think Mr. Blinken is actually making a very good choice on his calendar schedule, because I think recently we've been facing the common problems, both China and America and the rest of the world. I think united together and shape a joint force is the only one way we can overcome these common problems rather than confrontation. So I think they were going to have a lot of things to discuss about, because we've noticed that they still putting a lot of the strong hands on the supply chain, especially on the tech side on China. So I think they can come here and shake hands and try to avoid a lot of unnecessary confrontation. And so that the whole world will benefit from this, not only China and the US, but also the rest of the world. And according to my knowledge and my source, probably this dialogue or this conversation can be very fruitful, because both sides are showing lots of sincerity.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching.
The nature of business is to bring value.